Welcome to our lecture series for the Human-Centered Design Bootcamp. In this video, we will be focusing on the test phase. The test phase is when you solicit feedback about the prototypes you have created from your users, and you have another opportunity to gain empathy for the people you are designing for. So now that you have developed your prototype, it is time to engage with stakeholders to test your ideas and receive authentic feedback, both positive and critical. Testing with users is a fundamental part of a human-centered design approach. You test to refine your solution, to validate through feedback from your users, and also to refine your understanding of the people for whom you are designing. Testing is another opportunity to understand your users. But unlike your initial empathy mode, you have now likely done more framing of the problem and created prototypes to test. Both these things tend to focus the interaction with users, but don't reduce your testing to just asking whether or not people liked your solution. Instead, continue to ask why and focus on what can you learn about the person and the problem as well as your potential solutions. At this stage, you are trying to figure out what worked and what didn't. So ask for feedback on your prototypes so we can rapidly iterate on the prototype until it meets user needs. Ideally, you can test within a real context of the user's life. For a physical object, ask people to take it with them and use it within their normal routines. For an experience, try to create a scenario in a location that would capture the real situation. If testing a prototype in situ is not possible, frame a more realistic situation by having users take on a role or task when approaching your prototype. A rule of thumb is always prototype as if you know you are right, but test as if you know you are wrong. Because testing is a chance to refine your solutions and make them better. And why do we test? To refine prototypes and solutions. Because testing informs the next iterations of prototypes. And sometimes this means going back to the drawing board. We might need to learn more about our user. So testing is another opportunity to build empathy through observation and engagement. And it often yields unexpected insights. So this is an opportunity for you to also refine and learn more about your point of view. Sometimes testing reveals that not only did you not get the solution right, but also that you failed to frame the problem correctly. And like prototype, testing is about convergence. By learning more about what works and what doesn't, we are refining our idea. We are eliminating aspects that are less relevant and doubling down on critical elements that are most likely to deliver the outcomes that we expect. The goal of this phase is to test your low resolution prototype with stakeholders to get authentic feedback. At the end of this phase, you should be clear about whether the solution you brainstorm has the potential to meet the needs you identified in your point of view statement. You should also have a clear sense of how you want to iterate your next prototype. Testing ideas early helps ensure that the solutions you are creating for those you are serving will meet their needs and actually solve the problems that matter the most to those stakeholders. So, a question to ask ourselves is what steps can we take to ensure that we test our ideas early before we have become overly invested in the solution? How can we learn from critical feedback in order to iterate our ideas to have the greatest potential impact? This is what we are going to learn throughout this lesson. Testing is an opportunity to really learn about your solution and your user. And there are different ways in which you can achieve that. You might tell a story, act out a skit, or create a playful advertisement for your prototype. You can do whatever works. This is the time where you and your team needs to become creative about what are the best ways in which you can come up with a prototype to test some of the assumptions that you have about your solution and the problem. Ask for feedback on your prototypes. This is an opportunity to learn about your user. So make sure you are reframing in your view and refining your prototype. The mindset for this phase is to learn from failure. We need to accept showing something imperfect and even deficient. So take a learning approach to testing, not a validating approach, a learning, and learn to integrate feedback back into the project while keeping your creativity. And the best ideas in the world are worthless until they are tested. So prevent yourself from being overly confident at the very beginning of the prototyping and testing stage. It's very important that the feedback comes from the user and not from your own imagination of what would be the best solution to address a specific problem. So make sure that you don't get too attached to the idea before doing some rounds of prototyping and testing. So here are a couple of tips on how to do proper testing. Show, don't tell. Let your users experience the prototype. Avoid over-explaining how your prototype works and how it is supposed to solve your users' problems. Let the user's experience in using the prototype speak for itself and observe their reactions. Remember that you are testing the prototype, not the user. Your prototype should be designed with the central question in mind, a question that you will put to the test during the testing phase. Make sure your users know what the prototype and test is about, but do not over-explain how the prototype works. Ask users to talk through their experience. When users are exploring and using the prototype, ask them to tell you what they are thinking. This may take some getting used to for most users, so it may be a good idea to chat about an unrelated topic and then prompt them by asking them questions such as, what are you thinking right now as you are doing this? Observe how your users use either correctly or incorrectly your prototype and try to resist the urge to correct them when they misinterpret how it's supposed to be used. User mistakes are valuable learning opportunities. Ask follow-up questions. Always ask follow-up questions, even if you think you know what the user means. Ask questions such as, what do you mean when you say blah, blah, blah? How did that make you feel? And most importantly, why? And understand what you want to learn and create an experience to test. Test with intentionality. Think about what you want to learn and make sure that you are building an experience that will allow you to get closer to that answer. And make sure your users can experience it. A testing session is not an interview session. So it's not only about talking, it's actually about doing and experiencing. So in that way, testing is different from an interview. Make sure that your prototype is not only something people can see, but also that they can interact with and experience it. And don't verify but falsify. Try to make your ideas fail. It's not about you proving yourself that your idea is the best. Try to find opportunities or gaps in your idea or solution that the user might be able to fill. Use your prototypes to elicit authentic responses and feedback about your idea. Selling your idea is the worst thing you can do when trying to gain feedback, but we naturally do it in a subtle way. We like to explain our reasoning and make things coherent for people, but doing so prevents understanding the user's interpretation and, in turn, the way they think. And finally, I'll leave you with this beautiful quote. Have the mindset of testing to learn, not testing to validate. So the measure of success is not whether your prototype succeeded or not. The measure of success is, did we learn what we expected to learn? Was this an exercise where our knowledge about the problem, the user got enhanced? If that's the case, then it was a successful testing session. Let's look at what are the kinds of things we test over time. We tend to start testing the concepts first and then the effects. So we start with low fidelity prototypes, and as we gain confidence in the path that we are taking, that our solution might actually work, we increase or we improve our prototypes to become more high fidelity. We start by testing the concept and thinking about, how do people react to my prototype? Is it desirable? Is this solution something that people want or need? And then we move into testing the experience. Do people actually will use it? And how does it work? And then we move into testing the behavior. Does behavior change? And finally, we test for outcomes. Does it produce the hypothesized outcomes? So as you can see, we start with the most basic questions around the concept and desirability, and then we start moving into feasibility and ultimately to test whether it generates the outcomes that we hypothesized. So how do we test? Let's look at some process essentials. There are basically three steps in how we test. The first one, we start by introducing ourselves and orient the participant. And make sure your user feel comfortable and provide a brief context and orientation about what's going to happen and what the test will be about. Second, create an experience. Set the stage for your users to experience your idea and let people interact and experience your solution. Guide your user through as needed, but without giving too much context and overly explaining. You can give the user some tasks and ask questions. Meanwhile, you should be observing the user's reactions, making interpretation, and listening to what they say. And finally, debrief and follow up questions. This is the moment where you let people talk about the experience and how they felt. So if you think about it, actually the first and third steps are quite similar to our empathy work. What is different here is the second step. We created an experience. We brought a prototype to give something to the user to experience and then talk about. So in a way, the prototype acts as a conversation starter. So test prototypes with multiple users and follow up with empathetic conversations. Remember to capture notes during testing, considering both physical and verbal reactions. And the ideal is to turn your prototype into an experiment, seeing how people interact with the concept in their real lives. In other words, putting it to a true test. So let's look at some testing guidelines. Test your prototypes on the right people. If you are designing for teachers, don't test your prototypes with parents. Make sure you are testing your prototypes with the intended audience that you are designing for. And always introduce your prototype as a work in progress. Though, invite participants to treat your rough prototype as if it were real. And as mentioned before, this is not about selling your idea. So don't try to defend it when the user gives you some feedback you might not agree with or like. And don't pitch or explain the entire solution. Let participants figure out on their own and ask the right questions. And as you know, asking the right questions are asking open ended questions. And when people come back to you and ask questions to you, make sure that you answer questions with questions. You can always ask for follow-up questions, such as why? Why do you think that is? And ask the users to think out loud and let them contribute with their ideas. So the mindset is be curious and listen actively. And remember to invite honesty, and you should stay neutral and be curious. As people are giving you meaningful feedback, be prepared to integrate some of that feedback on the fly. One common question we get a lot is how many tests should we do? In reality, the research shows us that 5 user tests per cycle are enough to reveal big patterns. What this means is once you tested your prototype with 5 people, you tend to get the same feedback over and over. So instead of continuing with testing with more users, you should go back and integrate all that feedback into a second round of prototyping. So make sure you evolve your prototype, you integrate that feedback into a second prototype, and then you go back to a new cycle. Okay, I get it. I understand that 5 user tests per cycle are enough. But how many cycles do I need? Well, that depends. Usually within 3 cycles, you get to a point where you feel pretty confident or not that your solution is the right one and has potential to address the problem that you have the intention to solve. So make sure that you keep flexible. Usually 3 rounds of testing are enough, but if not, then you might want to keep going. Let's look at some tools and methods we will be using during the test phase. The tools in the test phase are designed to help you construct tangible tests of your solutions. In this particular video, I will be covering only the first 3 tools, which are the ones we will be using during the bootcamp. Test a prototype, the first tool, is a tool designed to help you plan the logistics of testing your prototypes. The reflection grid, the second, is a tool designed to help you make sense of what you learned from testing your prototype. And finally, the third tool, what did we learn, asks you to reflect on what assumptions you are making about why your idea will solve your stakeholders' problem. As usual, you can refer to the guidebook for more depth and guidance. You will find instructions, more detailed ones on how to use each of the tools. You'll have a case study, some facilitation tips, and also some reflections, tools, and rubrics that will help you and your team self-assess your progress. So let's look at the first one, test a prototype. Test a prototype is a tool designed to help you plan the logistics of testing your prototypes. Testing prototypes require a little bit of planning, so this tool will help you think through those logistics. Now that you have decided what prototype you want to conduct in order to test your assumptions, you can use this tool to help you plan the testing of your prototype. Remember, a good prototype involves a small number of stakeholders and requires little time to prepare and implement. And you do not need to use every box if some of them are not relevant to your project. So this tool presents you 8 different questions to help guide your team through the planning of your testing session. The first question is about what assumptions you will be testing with your prototype. The second asks you to generate a list of people who would you like to have participate in your prototype. The third question asks you who might help you to test the prototype. What do you need in order to get your prototype tested? Who should come to help? The fourth question, where will you test the prototype? The fifth, how will you set up the space? What materials you need? Is there anything else that you need to prepare? And finally, what are the steps that you need to complete in order to test your prototype? Let's look at one specific example back from our playbook idea, which you can also find in your guidebook. So the first question, what assumptions you will be testing with your prototype? The team decided that there was two assumptions to be tested. What formats are going to be the most accessible to different parts of the playbook? And also, the other question or assumption was, do caregivers have capacity, time, and capability to use the playbook we designed? In the second box, we will generate a list of people who we would like to have participate in our prototyping and testing session. For this particular example, we decided that we want to involve two people, Halima, who lives in Kenya and is the aunt of school-aged children, and Arjun, who lives in India and is teaching relatives at home. Who might help you to test the prototype? Here we decided to bring in the whole team, Katie, Gray, Saad, Munir, and Sarayu. Where will you test the prototype? Well, due to COVID, we are going to use Zoom for now. Hopefully, we'll do it in person some point soon. How will you set up the space? Well, we will debrief the testers and set the expectations for the test. For example, how much time would be required to complete the test. We will give some context and provide some additional information. What materials will you need? We will send an email to all the participants' marketing and information. We need the table of contents for what the playbook will include. We also need the promotional video to understand what value the playbook will offer. Anything else you need to prepare? We will need to find a variety of content for the table of contents. This is to be done. What are the steps that you need to complete in order to test your prototype? Well, here are the 8 steps that our team outlined. We will schedule Zoom calls with stakeholders and send calendar invite. We will welcome stakeholder and establish expectations. We'll send an email with a link to the table of contents and YouTube video and ask them to open and review it. We'll ask stakeholders to talk through each step and record their reactions as they go through the prototype. We'll then debrief with stakeholder. We will ask questions such as, how was the content received? What was that experience like? What did you like about the content? What could be improved? How might you use this resource? How frequently might you refer to it? When might you turn to it? What content felt most exciting? And then finally, we'll thank stakeholders for their time. So plan your testing approach. Think about how you are going to create an experience for the user. What is the scenario or context that you need to find or produce to get quality feedback on your prototype? Think about how will you observe or otherwise see the prototypes in use? How will you follow up for discussion with those who test the concept? The second tool in our testing phase is the reflection grid. The reflection grid is a tool designed to help you make sense of what you learned from testing your prototype. The primary goal of testing a prototype is to reflect and learn about your idea and whether it meets the needs of the stakeholder or not. So you can use this tool to capture what you learn from testing. You should take notes about what you observe, capturing the physical and verbal reactions of users, as well as notes from follow-on interviews. Use a shared visual structure like this reflection grid to review the feedback. You are missing an opportunity if you don't unpack and synthesize the feedback with the same vigor as you did with your empathy findings. So have each team member headline important points on post-its, say it verbally, and put it on board. Consider what the results tell you about your solution, concepts, as well as your perspective on the challenge. As you can see in this grid, there are four quadrants of comments that we can embed: the likes, the dislikes, the questions, and ideas. Let's look at each of these quadrants in more detail. These are some of the questions that you want to make sure you collect feedback on. The good: what did people value the most? What got them excited? What convinced them about the idea? You also want to focus on the bad. What failed? Were there suggestions for improvement? What needs further investigation? You also want to capture new ideas. What can I add to make it better? And which new ideas arise? And don't forget to also list questions. What questions do I have now that I've gone through several rounds of prototyping and testing? And what was the unexpected? Did anything happen that you didn't expect? You can use this grid because it helps you to be systematic about feedback and more intentional about capturing thoughts in these four different areas. This is an example of what the reflection grid might look like at the end of this exercise. As you can see, we captured a number of post-its for each quadrant with relevant observations based on the several questions that outline this tool. This tool is extremely helpful to make sense of what you experienced and capture areas of potential opportunities that you would like to address as you create your next prototype. These notes will also help you to answer the following questions. What did you learn about your idea, your user, and the problem? And how will the feedback you received inform your next steps? Let's look at the last tool from our testing phase. What did we learn? What did we learn asks you to reflect on what assumptions you are making about why your idea will solve your stakeholders' problem. This tool also asks you to continue to iterate based on what you learn from your testing. So reflect on what assumptions you tested, what you learned, and how you will iterate on your idea. The way this tool works is very simple. You start by asking, what was the assumption that this prototype was designed to test? And you will write down here. Then you will reflect on, what did you learn? What did you learn from your stakeholders about the assumption you were testing? And then once you capture that learning, what you will do with it? How will you iterate on your idea based on your stakeholder feedback? And you will do this for each and every assumption that was tested. So let's look at one example. Again, this is an example from the playbook idea. First, assumption. What was the assumption that this prototype was designed to test? Well, the assumption was, what formats are going to be most accessible to different populations? What did you learn? What did you learn from your stakeholders about the assumption you were testing? Well, we learned a lot of things. These are some of the things that we either observed or we heard the user say. Things such as, if you give me a 100-page PDF, I won't read it. I want to know where it's coming from and rooted in expert knowledge. I would prefer something local that is actually proven by an authority. I like the idea of a website that has all the videos in one place and lets them see weekly. If I was going to search online, then I would get so many results that I would get confused. We love watching and listening rather than reading. And finally, The team also observed that the users were smiling and being engaged when they saw the video. So, what will we do with all this feedback? How will you iterate on your idea based on stakeholder feedback? Well, we are going to integrate all of it. We are going to make the next iteration of our prototype more visual, more entertaining. We will use videos, use comics, and use cartoons. Testing sessions are most fruitful when they are carefully planned and organized. As with each stage in the human-centered design process, testing should provide new insights to inform your understanding and to help you define or redefine the various problems that the users might face. Therefore, you must seek feedback wherever possible, conduct tests using real people, and analyze the results to determine what is working well and what is causing problems. And always remember that if you are not prepared to be wrong, you'll never come up with anything great. So approach testing with openness, humility, respect, and intention. Thank you, and see you in the next lecture.